So moving on to the war in the Pacific. So remember, we were fighting two wars. So I just told you some of the dates and the conferences for the war in Europe. So the war in the Pacific, which is the war against Japan. In that conflict, that war, that area, Douglas MacArthur was the commander. And the U.S. followed a strategy called island hopping before reaching mainland Japan. There were a lot of islands, of course, there are a lot of islands around Japan. And the U.S. strategy was island hopping. So it attacked islands along the way. Sometimes it also just needed to be able to set up places to land, like Iwo Jima was a big a battle area, and it's because they also needed a place for their planes that were damaged. They couldn't always get all the way back to another spot to repair, or if somebody was injured. So we needed to set up bases. So that's Iwo Jima was fought. One of the reasons was for that. So the island hopping before reaching mainland Japan, some of the islands attacked, and that you will hear battles about were Midway. That's one of the big battles, the Battle of Midway, Midway. Iwo Jima, which is Iwo, separate word Jima, and Okinawa. Truman had decided, by then Truman was president, FDR had died. He decided a mainland invasion of Japan would be too costly in terms of casualties, that it would be too difficult to attack Japan, and we would lose too many people. So he put in an order for the Enola Gay, which was a plane, to drop the first atomic bomb. They called it Little Boy, which seems a little bizarre, but on August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was bombed and 140,000 people died. Nagasaki was bombed 3 days later, leading to an estimated 70,000 deaths. So instead of risking going to Japan and attacking with the people, with soldiers, the first atomic bomb, first two atomic bombs were used on Japan. Right after that, of course, Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945. That was the point. VJ is called Victory in Japan Day, was September 2nd. So that's what happened there. What are some of the arguments supporting the dropping of the atomic bomb? It seems pretty difficult now to discuss that. But very often that appears on an essay somewhere because it's a moral, ethical, what do? You're in a war, your country was attacked, a lot of people were killed, now you're drawn into a war. This is a way to end it a little faster and with fewer casualties on your side, but a lot of innocent people are going to be killed. So here are the pros to that. If you were to write an essay, this is what is expected. The bomb did put a speedy end to the worst war in world history. That was our worst war. We were fighting it on two fronts, and it did put an end to that. It showed the world, and especially the Soviets, that the U.S. was a great superpower. The Americans had suffered terrible casualties in the Battle of Okinawa in 1945 and a lot of the other battles, so they knew that a mainland invasion of Japan could have led to over 1 million casualties on the U.S. side, and they felt that they should not have to take that kind of a loss. The Manhattan Project, which was the bomb plan, so if you hear the Manhattan Project, it's the bomb plan. It cost about $2 billion, and it showed, so the bomb was also kind of a display of America's scientific investment, what we could do now. It was obviously the worst, most powerful weapon, and there was the idea that if we need to use it or let them know we have it, kind of a deterrent, but also in this case, it could save millions of American lives by attacking Japan and ending the war. The Japanese had refused to surrender unconditionally. There was a code, the Bushido Code, the kamikaze pilots, which would sooner die crashing into American ships than surrender. And so they were not going to give up. The Japanese were warned with leaflets describing the new weapon, what could happen, warning them they need to surrender because we have a bomb that can destroy so many, and still they refused to surrender. So what are some of the arguments against dropping the bomb? Well, would be what you would present on the con side if you were writing an essay. The Japanese were all but defeated at that point, and that just means that they were losing. They just would not admit it or give up. And even General Eisenhower believed that the war could be won through conventional means. Of course, you have to take into account that you still have a lot of people, Americans, that would die to get to that point, but it could be done without dropping the bomb. There's the worry that the use of the weapon would frighten the Soviets because that they would then start to escalate, and there would be the bitter Cold War, which we ended up with because they felt like if the U.S. had that much power, then they needed some power. So then we have the whole escalation of the bombs. Another obviously argument against it is it was dropped on civilians. Hiroshima was not a military base, it was a city. So same thing could be said about the bombing of Nagasaki. These were cities. They were not military bases or soldiers. Again, and the Manhattan Project, the con against the fact that we had spent $2 billion creating a deadly weapon was that we had just gotten out of the Great Depression, and some people would say that was an awful lot of money to invest in something for war. Another one is the environmental destruction after dropping the bomb on Japan was immense. I mean, it's hard to even measure how long the water, soil, air was poisonous to those people for, generations to come, I believe. Cancers and illnesses could result from the bombing went on for decades. So some people see that as immoral, cruel, so those are some of the cons. You have to, people balance that out, figure it out in their own minds. It's not up to me to judge. But those are some of each side would have some of those arguments, right? You have to look at the war, what you were facing, what you had at your disposal, to use it or not to use it. So that's the Japanese war. All right. So while that happened, what do you need to know about what was going on in America at home? Because the war, other than Pearl Harbor, was not fought on our soil. It was fought in Europe. It was fought in the Pacific, the islands. But for our states, we weren't being attacked here but we were obviously involved in the war. So what was happening we call it the home front during World War II? Manufacturing boomed. Again, this is part of the reason that war, as horrible as it is, got us out of the Depression, because manufacturing boomed. Troops went overseas, women stepped into the factories. So it was one of the first times that women were encouraged to come out of their homes and not be considered just, housewives, someone who has to stay home, that they actually were needed to work in the factories. And it was some of the first times that women started feeling that they could do that, and led to some other feelings of women having a little more independence. They were nicknamed Rosie the Riveter because they were actually, have pictures and posters of propaganda of women with their hair in do-rags or whatever they call them, that look like they're ready to work. They've got power tools in their hands, and they're riveting. They're doing something with riveting. They call it Rosie the Riveter. It has to do with airplanes. So rivet is some bolt on a ship or something, and they had to put those in. So that's why they're called Rosie the Riveter. If you ever hear a reference to that, it's the women who came out and started working in the factories to take the place of all the men who had gone overseas to fight. Besides women, some Native Americans were able to left the reservations to work in the defense plants. They were also code talkers. They call them code talkers. In the war overseas, because they could communicate in a language that the Japanese had never heard and were not able to break. So in wartime, people talk in code, they write codes, and the Navajo language was not something the Japanese were able to break because they didn't have Native Americans in Japan, so they didn't have the language. So that made the Native Americans here quite valuable in terms of being able to create codes that the Japanese could not break. Here at home, unions agreed not to strike so that the materials would continually be produced, and that was important. Remember, unions can strike if they don't agree with the working conditions, the pay, the hours, and obviously you can't have people striking during a war. That's a little too important. Rationing of meat, gas, and iron was critical to make sure that there was enough of it so that the troops had all the supplies they needed. So the people at home were more supportive of being very careful with rationing. I know sugar was a big deal. All of the things that they needed to save and make sure, especially when it came to meat, gas, iron, anything that the troops would need or you would need in manufacturing so that we would have enough of what was needed for the war. The war was paid for by a combination of increasing income tax and war bonds. So you'll see a lot of propaganda posters from that time period, not only encouraging people to save for the war in terms of supplies, making sure they don't overuse, but also buying war bonds so that they can raise money to fight the war. So there are a lot of campaign posters you would see that would encourage Americans to be patriotic, support the war, support the cause by purchasing bonds. The war cost over $288 billion at that time, and over 290,000 American lives were lost. Right? So that's that section. And what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II? This was another dark period where we basically stopped believing in our own rights. What we always say, that we believe very strongly that people cannot be prosecuted or put away or put in jail because without due process, without going to court, without having a fair trial. Well, again, when the country gets scared, when something happens, terrorism, war, there is sometimes a tendency to ignore that, and this is one of those times. So the Japanese Americans, they were Americans living in America, they were Japanese descent. There was a great deal of concern about potential Japanese American sabotage in the war effort. You don't know who's on your side or not. We have been attacked by the Japanese. We're in a huge war with Japan. So there was fear. And FDR signed Executive Order 9066 in 1942. Obviously, the war was still going on. I know we jump around in our dates, but these are kind of sections of things you need to know during the war. And it permitted the government to transform the West Coast into a military zone. So about 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast were relocated and forced to live in internment camps. Now, these weren't concentration camps of the Nazis and that in Europe, but they were internment. They were isolated areas. They were being separated, and obviously they couldn't leave, and their things were taken away from them. They suffered property loss, wage loss. Most of the camps were in isolated areas. This is all because, remember, the president can suspend habeas corpus in the time of war, which has been done a few times that we've talked about, and that just means suspend a person's right to fair trial and to see if they're guilty before you punish them. So this was done in the name of protecting the country. Now, definition you need to know. Court case, of course. Korematsu, Korematsu, V for verse, United States, 1944. Okay, so this was a court case about the internment camps, And this Fred Korematsu, which is why his last name is in the court case, and that is helpful because when you see that, it does help you think about what the court case is about. They're not random. Korematsu refused to go to the internment camp. He was told he needed to report. He was a Japanese American. He needed to report to the internment camp. He refused to, so he was arrested. His criminal case, because remember, if you take the case to Supreme Court, then they will decide whether it's constitutional or not, and that pretty much becomes the law of the land. So the court did not agree with him. The 1944 Korematsu decision stated that the 14th Amendment, though it did guarantee equality in regular circumstances, because the 14th Amendment, they're citizens, they have a right to the Constitution, they have a right to all of the rights of everybody else because the 14th Amendment gave you citizenship if you were born here. It could be denied in the time of war. So in this case, the Supreme Court supported the president, who said that this is unusual circumstances, this is time of war, I have to suspend habeas corpus, I do have a right to take people and put them in a place where I think to safeguard the country. So the 14th Amendment, although it is something that we support, it does not guarantee that in the time of war. So Executive Order 9066 was declared constitutional. And once the Supreme Court sees it and then declares it constitutional or not, that becomes the law. That's as far as you can go. The federal government eventually acknowledged that they shouldn't have done that. They were sorry, but that's later. That's when the war is over and people aren't as afraid. And then they look back and say, yeah, we probably shouldn't have done that. That they regretted the internment and they gave all the survivors $20,000 in 1988. I'm pretty sure that did not make up for what they went through or the property they lost, the wages they lost, and everything else. But anyway, they were told that the country apologized, said that we were wrong, should not have done that, and gave every survivor $20,000 in 1988. And then the record was wiped clean. That was the end of that. Okay, another definition you need to know. This is just another section. You'll hear zoot suits and braceros. These are just two words you need to know. Zoot suit, a Z-O-O-T, was just a popular clothing. Young Mexican Americans living in Los Angeles. And some servicemen stationed in the area, there's that anti-immigrant, anti-anything different sentiment towards these young people who wore the zoot suits. Servicemen thought that the zoot suits were unpatriotic. In 1943, a race riot broke out where many of the people wearing these zoot suits were beaten and had their clothing removed. The police looked the other way. I don't know why this is in the information of one of the most important things that you need to know for this test. I think it's just adding to the idea that the whole anti-Mexican, anti-sentiment, some of the things that went on just were continued, it went on throughout history. Many Mexican Americans served proudly in the military. They also helped fill in for the labor in the United States. And many of the Mexicans, workers took advantage, not in a bad way, it just means that they used the Bracero program, and it offered them temporary labor to Mexican workers who wanted to come to the United States and work during World War II in agriculture, because we had lost so many people to war. We needed to fill in, just like women were filling in factories, Native Americans were filling in factories. Now some of the Mexican citizens were able to come here and work. At that time, it was legal for them to do that until after the war. They lasted, I think, actually the program lasted till like 1960s sometime, where then it was not legal for them to be here anymore. So some of the domestic results of World War II. So now you know what went on, what happened during the war, who was involved in it, how we got in, how we went from neutrality to being involved in two wars, and how both wars ended. At home, the results of World War II. Soldiers returned and there was a population boom. So it's called the baby boom. And still today you'll hear baby boomers. And that's referred to that generation, that group of people who were born when all the men came home from war. So um, the 22nd Amendment prevented another president from seeking a third term. So as we've talked about before, until this time that there was actually an amendment that limited the president to 2 terms, it was just a precedent. It was just because George Washington had done it that way, and every president after that stopped after 2 terms. Nobody wanted to make it look as though we were going to be, they wanted to be a king or a dictator. So they went for 2 terms if they could get it. Some only made it through 1 4-year term. But 2 was the limit, but it wasn't a law, it was a precedent. So once FDR stayed in for so long, he was into his 4th term when he died. Some people didn't like that. Some people started thinking that maybe he was spent too much time, that we don't want to have that become the new precedent, that presidents now can go on until they want to leave. So the 22nd Amendment prevented another president. That limited the elections to just 2 terms for a president, and just because FDR did it because there was so much going on at the time. It was at home with the Depression and abroad with 2 wars, but that wasn't going to happen again. So 22nd Amendment, now a president can only be elected to 2 terms. Consecutively or not. They can't come back and do it again either. We can't take a president we really like and have him come back, after he's had a break. All right, World War II vets took advantage of the GI Bill. So it's the GI Bill is just short for the, it's not really short, it's the name for the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. So Servicemen's Readjustment is just, if you think of readjustment, it's coming back to the country after war, getting adjusted, readjusting to life here. And it offered free college, vocational training, good loans on homes and businesses. Very, very popular, still a very important kind of a bonus for people who are in the service, who serve. A lot of people go in and serve for 8, whatever years they do in the service. Then they come out and they're able to go to use some of the programs to go to school. I know my dad bought our first house on his GI Bill because it gives you low interest rates. So there were some bonuses given, some help to servicemen coming back. So those were important because the GI Bill you'll still hear about today if that comes up. The GI Bill, Servicemen's Readjustment, offered college, vocational training, good home loan rates so that people could come back and get their lives back together after serving through such horrible war. Buy houses, start small businesses, things like that. All right, after the war, there was also a mass exodus from the cities and a move out to the suburbs. People were wanting to get out of the cities. Remember, cities were getting pretty crowded, and people just kind of wanted to get out. So President Eisenhower, and then I told you Eisenhower earlier, now Eisenhower is president. He signed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956, and that provided for the modern day highway system that we have. So now you can go out to the suburbs because there are highways everywhere. So that was part of, we had our interstate highways. Obviously they were so important, but now you pretty much have highways going everywhere. So we have a modern interstate highway system. Made it easier for people to travel, move, and get out to the suburbs. 1950s saw a lot of conformity, a lot of people who did things in a similar way, just what conformity means. People worked, the schedules were more like 9 to 5. You talk about 9 to 5, it's kind of a traditional work day here. So people talk about traditionally working 9 to 5, raising their families. A lot of people were living out of the cities and the suburbs. So it was kind of a little bit different pace of life. But if you think back and compare that to some of the earlier times when people were working, 16-hour days and you had child labor, and there's just things are changing. And in the 1950s, it was the conformity of a work day that most people were familiar with, 9 to 5, raising families in the suburbs. That created kind of a generation or a group of people who didn't like the conformity, that were like, oh, that's just too boring. and that upset people. So they were called the Beat Generation. And this is important because it moves. You see how in history something's happening and something triggers so that an event or a movement. So then you get into the next movement, and then you see, well, why did that happen? It happened because some people were thinking that this was boring, that people were too conformist, that they were too structured. Everybody's in the or not everybody, but people are in the suburbs, they're working 9 to 5 jobs, their kids are in school. It's too much conformity. So the Beat Generation, BEAT, they were also called beatniks. They started experimenting, getting a little more on the edge and the wild side. They experimented with being more sexually active, with drugs. They started to reject materialism, like we don't want what you have. We don't want the house. We don't want the car. It's not important. We're more practicing more Eastern religions, getting more into spirituality. One of the beatnik books you need to know is Jack Kerouac's, Kerouacs. Okay, that's very important in terms of literature in this period, especially with that movement, the Beat Generation. Jack Kerouac, I have a hard time saying his name, Jack Kerouac, and he wrote a book called On the Road. In terms of art in this period, a name you need to know is Jackson Pollock, Pollock, because his work was not conformist at all. It was anything but. One of the most famous abstract expressions of all time. He was known for dripping and splattering paint onto canvases, and it's all perspective when it comes to art. But when you look at some of these things, you can see that it was a period of time where people were experimenting. So I'll leave it at that. But you should know a couple of the names of the artists and authors from that time period, and that they were going against what they felt was too much conformity of society at the time. And also in music, very important, going against conformity at the time, that things were too tranquil, too blasé, so we had rock and roll, okay, music of the 50s. Elvis Presley, Elvis Presley combined African American blues, country, and jazz to create a new musical sound, and that would be rock and roll. At the time, now it was before my time, but I do know that Elvis Presley was seen as risque. He was always shaking his hips, which just kind of really upset a lot of the parents. It was pretty strict in terms of what kids or what people were allowed to see. So when you have Elvis Presley out there with this new music, shaking his hips, and it really upset people. But that's rock and roll, and it was in the 50s, and it was kind of a reaction to some of the conformity that was going on in the country at that time. People would come back from war, and they just wanted some peace. They wanted to settle down. They wanted a 9-to-5 job and raise their kids, and so this was a reaction to that. There was also a move in our country to the Sun Belt, where land was a little cheaper, and there was more of it, and that was in the South and the Southwest. Now, this was in the 50s, because right now I live in the Sun Belt, and the Sun Belt is super expensive because the weather is so good, and more people live here now, so we don't have all this extra land. So, but that was quite a while ago. Rosie the Riveter, the lady who came out of the house and was appreciated for working in the factories. She went back home. More women were raising families, and the 1950s were conservative in time of women's rights. Obviously, they had the right to vote by then, but they were also expected to be home with a family, and so that's where they went. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 was passed over Truman's veto. That was when Truman was president. It hurt the unions badly, and certain types of strikes were prohibited. Remember, the main power the union has, besides collective bargaining, is that if they don't like what's happening and they think they're being treated unfairly, they go on strike. So when you go on strike, work shuts down, then the business that you're striking against knows you're serious, and they then start to negotiate with you and try to work it out. If you don't have that, if you can't strike, then you lose a lot of power. You can't make them come to the table and bargain with you because they just don't have to now. You're still working. So the Taft-Hartley Act, it hurt unions, and because it prohibited certain types of strikes. It also ended the closed shops. Closed shops meant that one had to be in a union to work in a particular industry. And in this case, it said, no, you don't. So say you were a plumber. Maybe you had to join the union to work as a plumber. That's called a closed shop. It's like you can't get in if you're not part of the union. It's closed to you. Well, this made that illegal. So you could no longer have a closed shop. You could no longer say if you're going to work here, you have to be part of the union. So think of it as the Taft-Hartley Act did hurt unions. It kept them from being able to strike in some cases and kept them from being able to require their workers to be a part of their union. Right? Foreign policy. How did foreign policy change as a result of World War II? Well, after World War II was over, the U.S. and Soviet Union both became superpowers, and the Cold War began. Because now you have two superpowers who now both can kill each other and everybody else in the world. And they're struggling for the power, and they're both afraid of each other, and it becomes a standoff that went on for years. I know here it was always practicing duck and cover in case there's a nuclear attack. There was just all this fear. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but that's what a Cold War is. You're not at war fighting, but it's a very frosty, cold relationship, and it could easily escalate. Okay, so after the war, Germany was defeated, obviously. And remember, after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, what that did. So now they came up with, what do we do with Germany again after this war? Germany was divided into occupational zones. So they were occupied, controlled by the Soviet Union in the east, and the Allies, Britain, France, the United States, and the West. So Germany was divided up into zones that were occupied and controlled by two different groups. The Soviet Union controlled the east part, and the Allies, Britain, France, and the United States, controlled the west. So that's why you had the two sections of Germany. All right, the United Nations was formed as an organization focusing on collective security. The idea was maybe if we have a group that can solve problems before they become a war, we can avoid another war. So collective security, the U.S., Soviet Union, France, Britain, and China are the 5 permanent nations with veto power. Veto just means they could say, no, that's not going to happen. Okay, the United Nations grew out of the Atlantic Charter of 1941, where Winston Churchill of Britain and FDR agreed to stabilize the world, if possible, with peace after the war ended. It's like we have to come up with a way to stabilize things so this doesn't keep happening. These were 2 huge, horrible, big wars. Before that, there was a League of Nations that the United States never joined, and it was after the Treaty of Versailles, and that so this had a little more teeth. It's unlike the League of Nations. The UN can also have peacekeeping troops. The League of Nations was a group dedicated to trying to solve some of the problems that caused the first war so it wouldn't happen again, but they didn't actually have troops or people to enforce that. It was more of trying to come up with solutions. So the United Nations actually can assemble peacekeeping troops, so the U.S. did join the UN. They had not joined the League of Nations earlier, but they did join the UN. So we still have